Assalamu alaikum. أهلا بيكم في another discussion regarding the parliament and several acts in Britain in the 18th century. So the Parliament of Great Britain was formed in May in 1707 following the ratification of the Acts of Union, يعني توثيق أو إبرام الActs of Union by both the Parliament of England and the Parliament of Scotland. The Acts ratified the treaty, وثقت وعملت تأكيد للمعاهدة الخاصة بالاتحاد, which created a new unified kingdom of Great Britain and created the Parliament of Great Britain located in the former home of the English Parliament in the Palace of Westminster near the city of London. وكان المكان بتاعه هو المكان الأصلي القديم في قصر ويستمنستر قريب من لندن. This lasting nearly a century until the Acts of Union in 1800 merged the separate British and Irish parliaments into a single parliament of the United Kingdom. جمعت هذه البارلمنتس الخاصة ببريطانيا وأيرلند into a single parliament في برلمان واحد of the United Kingdom with effect from the 1st January in 1800. Following the Treaty of Union in 1706, Acts of Union ratifying the treaty were passed in both the Parliament of England and the Parliament of Scotland, which created a new kingdom of Great Britain. The Acts paved the way for the enactment of the Treaty of Union, which created a new parliament referred to as واللي احنا بنسميه Parliament of Great Britain, based in the home of the former English Parliament. So all the traditions, procedures and standing orders of the English Parliament were retained, although there is no provision for this within the treaty, and to this day this is a continuous issue, as were the incumbent officer and members representing England comprised the overwhelming majority of the new body. هذا الكيان الجديد. It was not even considered necessary to hold a new general election, while Scots law and Scottish legislation remained separate. New legislation was therefore to be enacted by the new parliament, with the exception of that pertaining to private right, which could only legislate on for the evident utility of the people. After the Hanoverian King George I ascended the British throne, بعد ما تقلد هو العرش البريطاني في 1714 through the Act of Settlement of 1701, real power continued to shift away from the monarchy. George was a German ruler, spoke poor English, and remained interested in governing his dominions in continental Europe rather than in Britain. He thus entrusted power to a group of his ministers, يعني خلى القوة تكون معظمها أو في قيادة his ministers وزرائه, the foremost of whom وكان على رأسهم أو أكبرهم Sir Robert Walpole. And by the end of his reign in 1727, the position of the ministers who had to rely on Parliament for support was cemented. George I's successor, his son اللي هو George II, continued to follow through his father's domestic policies. كان بيتبع نفس نظام والده جورج I and made little effort وعمل جهد قليل جدا to re-establish monarchical control over the government, which was now in firm control by Parliament. By the end of the 18th century, the monarch still had considerable influence over Parliament, which was dominated by the English aristocracy by means of patronage, but had ceased to exert direct power. For instance, the last occasion on which royal assent was withheld was in 1708 by Queen Anne. At general elections, the vote was restricted to freeholders and landowners. خلوا بس كل أصوات الانتخاب تكون خاصة بالفريهولدرز وأصحاب الأراضي since the Middle Ages, so that in many rotten and pocket boroughs seats could be bought, while major cities remained unrepresented, except by the knights of the shire representing whole counties. Reformers and radicals sought parliamentary reform. بدأ يظهر عندي مجموعة من الإصلاحيين والراغبين في التغيير الجذري. But as the French Revolution wars developed, the British government became repressive against dissent, and progress towards reform was stalled. King George II successor اللي هو George III sought to restore royal supremacy and absolute monarchy, but by the end of his reign, the position of the king's ministers, who discovered that they needed the support of parliament to enact any major changes, had become central to the role of British governance and would remain so ever after. During the first half of the George III reign, the monarch still had considerable influence over parliament, which itself was dominated by the patronage and influence of the English nobility. Most candidates for the House of Commons were identified as Whigs or Tories, but once elected, they formed shifting coalitions of interest rather than dividing along clear party lines. At general elections, the vote was restricted in most places to property owners, which were out of date and didn't reflect the growing importance of manufacturing towns or shifts of population. Reformers بقى like William Bickford and radicals beginning with John Wilkes called for reform of the system. دعوا لإصلاح هذا النظام. In 1780, a draft program of reform was drawn by بدأ يظهر عندي زي مسودة لنظام تغيير was drawn by Charles James Fox and Thomas Brand Hollis and put forward by a subcommittee of the electors of Westminster. This included calls for the 6 points later adopted by the Chartists. The American War of Independence ended in defeat for a foreign policy that sought to prevent the 13 American colonies from breaking away and forming their own independent nation, something which George III had fervently advocated. And in March 1782, the king was forced to appoint an administration, أجبر إن هو يعين إدارة led by his opponents, which sought to curb royal patronage. In November of 1783, he took the opportunity to use his influence in the House of Lords to defeat a bill to reform the Honorable East Indian Company, dismissed the government of the day, and appointed William Pitt the Younger to reform a new government عشان يكون حكومة جديدة. Pitt had previously called for Parliament to begin to reform itself, but he didn't press for long for reforms the king didn't like. Proposals Pitt made in April 1785 to redistribute seats from the rotten boroughs to London and the counties were defeated in the House of Commons عن طريق 248 صوت ل 174 by 248 votes to 174. In the wake of the French Revolution of 1789, radical organizations such as the London Corresponding Society sprang up to press for parliamentary reform. بدأت إنها بتضغط من أجل إصلاح برلماني. But as the French Revolutionary Wars developed, the government took extensive repressive measures against feared domestic unrest, applying the democratic and egalitarian ideals of the French Revolution, and progress toward reform was stalled for decades.